Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, have you ever wondered how a knife maker goes about designing a new knife? Well, today you'll find out. So today I'm going to be talking about, I guess you'd say, the thought process I went through as I designed this new little neck knife for my Tactics Armory collection. You can find those at tacticsarmory.com if you want more information. But anyway, the thing that's interesting to me about this right here, I think most people look at a design and they sort of think, well, it looks cool or it doesn't. And then when they hold it and they use it, they think about the ergonomics and the functionality of the knife. But there is a ton of other stuff that knife makers have to think about when they're making a knife or when they're designing a knife. Now, I used to design with a pencil and paper, or actually I just come out here, and I just grind the blade directly on the grinder and see how it came out. But now I do everything on the computer first. So I'll walk you through a bunch of the stuff that I was thinking about as I was trying to juggle working on this little knife. So let's jump over to the computer and I'll get started. Okay, so I'm pretty excited about this, and I don't know if anybody else is, but anyway, who cares? I'm excited about it. And here's why. I think a lot of people imagine that what knife design is about, saying, oh, that looks cool, coming up with a knife design that just kind of looks cool. But really, knife design is so much more than that, and that's really, that's about a tenth of what knife design is really about. So let me preface what I'm doing here. I'm going to actually show some stuff here. For the moment, you're just going to be kind of stuck here staring at a bunch of completely uninteresting junk here, but we'll circle back and you'll see why I'm talking about this stuff. Anyway, for those of you who are just catching this new and don't really know anything about me, I've got a little knife business. I've had it for a long time, and one of the things that I do is that I kind of private label knives for other folks, sometimes martial arts type guys or trainers or other knife makers. It varies, but in any case, I private label something for a guy who's combatives trainer, and one of the things that I had to stress to him initially is, look, the real issue is not just how much does it cost on a per unit basis to make a knife, but how much goes into the design up front. And he was like, well, I know this guy who's a CAD CAM wizard, and, I could probably get him to make it for you in an afternoon. And I was like, no, you don't understand what I'm talking about. Just designing a thing that you can look at and say, hey, that looks like a knife, that is easy. And I'm going to show you just how simple this is. This is, by the way, this is not a CAD CAM, how to design stuff on a computer video. The point here is to really talk about my process for designing a knife, just all the facets of thinking up a knife. So real quickly here, I want to show you how easy it is. If you have a basic familiarity with how the computer works and you've fiddled around with designing knives, this is how quickly you can make a knife. So this is not going to be a good knife. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how quickly somebody could design a knife if they wanted to. So let's see. Spline, dink, dink, dink. Oh, there's a blade. Okay, now let's finish up the handle. Let's make a line here to here. That's super great. Boom. Now let's put a little line across here. There's that right there. There's our handle. And we're going to do this right here. Sure, that looks good. And then we're going to go like this. Now we got a knife design. Now, obviously, this is a crummy little knife design, but what did that take me, like 3 minutes? Now, again, this is a horrible looking little knife, but the point is that just the simple design of a knife is extremely easy to do. So what I was doing in this particular instance was just trying to come up with a whole bunch of little designs. So what I'm going to be walking you through here, at least to some degree, is this new knife that I'm working on called the Luna, which is a very simple neck knife. And my aim on it was to be something that would be that I could sell at a reasonable price point, that wasn't going to be super hard to make, but that would be just very functional and basic. I was just trying out different designs really quickly, and there were a whole bunch of other ones, I think, here that I did. So this is a pretty simple thing. So here's kind of the process that I go through. I'll talk specifically about the Luna here as we go, but this is just a jumping off point to talk about generally how I go about not designing knives. So the first thing that I do when I start designing a knife is I think about what the function is. Is it a hunting knife? Is it a tactical knife? Is it an art knife, bushcraft, whatever it might be? And that is then going to dictate, at least to some degree, how big they are. So in this case, this is a neck knife. It's obviously got to be pretty small because it's hanging around your neck. So I think I originally designed it at 5 inches, which was a little too big, and so I had to scale it down to ultimately to about 4.5 inches. But that's something that you have to think about up front when you think about a design. And of course, most of the time, this is completely instinctive. When you say, well, I'm going to design a knife, you're not just randomly trying to design some knife out of thin air. You're thinking, well, it's going to be a hunting knife. It's going to be, whatever kind of category it is. But that's something that you have to define kind of early in the process. You also have to think about, maybe, is it forged or is it stock removal? And of course, if you've done a particular type of design, let's say you make lots of kukris, you don't need a design per se. What I'm talking about here is really if you're planning on designing something that you're going to make multiple versions of. That's really mostly what I'm talking about here. How do you refine that design? And so you have to go through and think about all these things. Now, assuming that you're not doing a forged knife, assuming that you're doing a stock removal knife, which is what this Luna here is going to be, one of the first things that you have to think about is what size stock are you going to use? Are you going to use something real thick, like 1/4 inch stock? Are you going to use 1/8? Are you going to use something even thinner than that? That's something you have to decide at the beginning. And most importantly, you have to decide how wide you want it to be. And let me just show you why that would be important. If I make this little design here, and let me go back to the original sketch here, and let's make a 1x1 box here. So this tells me that this knife can be made on 1 inch stock right here. But what if I said, oh, I want to put in a little guard kind of thing here, one of these little nib sort of things that comes down here like that. Okay, again, this is just a silly representation. It wouldn't actually look like that. But let's say you have this little piece. All of a sudden, that means that you need, stock is typically sold in 1 and then 1.5 inch sizes. You can get 1 1/4 sometimes, but it's harder to get in particular types of steel. Maybe it's not available. You can pretty much always find 1.5 inch stock though. Okay, so let's say you decide I want to have this little feature here. Now that means that you're going to have to get this much stock. Now, that's expensive, or it's more expensive, but it also means that when you make this knife, you got to grind off all of this material right here. You just added 15 minutes of work for every single knife, or whatever the number is, just so you can add this little tiny feature here. And so you have to ask yourself, well, is that worth it? Is that really what I want to do with this particular knife? These are the kind of things that, if somebody's just sitting around their house and they say, oh, I want to draw a pretty picture of a knife, they're not going to think about the fact that they might have created this enormous amount of extra work and expense. You basically increased the price of your steel by 50% just by adding this little thing right there. That little nub just cost you an extra $10 per knife. Now, if you're just making this for yourself or for a friend or something, maybe you don't care. This is your hobby and you're just having fun out there grinding. Great, then that design works for you. But if this is something that you're going to manufacture at scale, or maybe you're going to sell to somebody else, or you're hoping to make 25 or 50 of these things and sell them at a gun show or something, maybe it starts making sense to get rid of that little feature there. So anyway, that's all the kind of stuff that you have to think about when you're first getting started, and that includes, what's the price point going to be? Obviously, size is one of your constraints here, but the more steel that you use, the more grinding you do, the more complicated the knife, the more you're going to have to charge in order to get back whatever you put into it. Again, you're doing this as a hobby, doesn't matter. You can do it however you want. But if you are thinking about selling one, this is the kind of thing that you start thinking about. So my buddy, who I was talking about earlier, to him, he just imagines, oh, you're just drawing a knife on the computer, and that's great, but he didn't really think, because he doesn't make knives, he didn't really anticipate how many of these little issues that you have to solve up front, and how much that constrains your design once you start getting into that. So anyway, what I was trying to do here was to, look at a whole bunch of little kind of primitive designs, I would call them. They're just like real basic shapes, and then try and work them up from there into something more complicated and interesting. This is super generic. There's nothing really super interesting about this. It's a very sound knife shape, but it's not super interesting. Anyway, once I've decided, okay, here's the price point, here's the category, here's the size that I want, the function, all that sort of thing, then I also want to start thinking about materials. And why do I need to think about materials up front? Well, obviously, if you're forging something, you're going to be using carbon steel, and there's some obvious kind of constraints like that. But there are going to be a whole lot of other things, like, for instance, am I going to make a handle out of wood as opposed to something else? If you're using something like micarta, an engineered material that you can get in really large sheets and you can divide it up however you want, then you can pretty much make any size and shape of thing that you want. Whereas if you're going to do it with wood, or let's say antler or bone, you might have thought, oh, I'm going to make this great big giant handle, but it starts becoming too expensive or too difficult to find antler that would actually fit that particular size. And so you got to think about all that stuff up front. Now, in this case, I'm actually aiming to do something that's not going to have handle scales at all, because part of my thinking on this particular knife is I'm looking for something that is going to be significantly less expensive than most of my knives. There are a lot of people who have seen me for years on YouTube or whatever, and they're all, they like to buy a knife from me, but they can't do it because, they just don't have the money to pay for a reasonably high-end American-made knife. But this gives sort of an entry-level type knife for the kind of things that I do. And so as I'm formulating this design, I'm thinking, okay, well, what can I strip out of this to keep it affordable? And in this case, there's a harmony between a neck knife design and no handle scales. So, because the point being that, you know, if you're putting this under your shirt and there's a little Kydex sheath holding it together, if it's super thin, then it's lighter, it's more concealable if that's an issue to you. It's less likely to snag on your clothes. There are a lot of reasons why not having handle scales might be good, and so in this case, I concluded that that was what I wanted to do for the initial design. Now, an important thing about this is that, you know, the normal thing here would be for you to actually have a handle on it. So let's just say that I was going to put a handle on here. Then there are going to be some holes drilled in here. Now, if you're going to make 50 of these, you might just say, hey, look, every single one of them, I'm just going to run over the drill press. I'm going to run a couple holes in here, and that's fine. There's no big issue with that. But maybe you want to use a drill guide so that every single time you do this, you throw the drill guide in there and you can do 2 holes that are 3 inches apart. Well, this handle is too short for a 3-inch drill guide. What if I don't have a drill guide that only, that I don't have like a 1.5 inch drill guide? Then, maybe I have a 2-inch guide, and so I want to extend this handle just so that I can fit that drill guide. And I'll talk more about manufacturability later, but my point is that I think most people tend to think that function and aesthetics, how it looks, are going to be the 2 main things that you think about. Those play into it, but you always have to balance those 2 design qualities with, okay, can I actually make this thing? Okay, so the next thing that I always think about are materials. Are the handles going to be micarta, wood? Are you going to make the knife out of Damascus steel or carbon steel versus stainless? It doesn't necessarily seem like you'd have to think about them up front, but in many cases you do. Just to give you a for instance, let's say you're going to make it out of carbon steel. So you say, well, carbon steel rusts, so I want to Cerakote it. Well, I want to make an integral like this, for instance. This knife right here, well, I'm showing it with the little hole in the middle there, but let's take this one over here. So here's a knife design, doesn't have any holes in it. Let's say I was making this out of carbon steel, which is not a very good choice for something that's going to be hanging next to your skin all day. But anyway, be that as it may, let's just say that's what I was doing here. If I want to Cerakote this, I need a hole. Like, that seems dumb, but if you're going to Cerakote something, you have to hang it. And so you actually have to think about that aspect of making the thing later on. So all of these material choices come into play when you start designing a knife. And the same is true of, what kind of steel you want to use or whatever. Those are all legitimate things to be concerned about up front. Okay, so now you've gotten over the hump of, okay, here's a design. What kind of features is it going to have? Are you going to have a clip point? Or, the first blade type is probably the main, first thing you're going to think about. Is it going to be a drop point, a clip point, Warncliffe, sheep's foot, Tonto point, all those things? Are you going to have holes of various types? Thong tube holes or jimping? Bolsters, you want to have an integral bolster or, brass bolsters or nickel silver bolsters or something like that. If you do, you're going to have pin holes for that. Are you going to use mosaic pins? Are you going to have a guard? Are you going to have a Spanish notch, choils, things like that? And, you tend to think of these as being just aesthetic choices or functional choices. But as we'll see sort of in the next section, all of these have implications for how you actually make the thing. All right, so the next thing that I think about is manufacturability. And when I say this, I don't necessarily mean like production line type consideration. I just mean literally, how do you plan to make the thing, and can you build? Do you actually have the tools and the knowledge to do what you need? And a lot of this is sort of obvious, and you don't have to think about it. If you're making a thing that's pretty similar to stuff that you've made before, and you're using the same kind of equipment, your drill press, your grinder, whatever else you might typically use, you don't necessarily have to think about this. But the more that you're starting to say, well, I want to scale this up, let's just say you decide, hey, it's Christmas is coming up, and I want to make 10 chef's knives, and I want to give them to all my friends because all my friends like barbecuing or whatever it might be. Okay, so 10 chef's knives is going to be a lot of work, so you'd like to make this as efficient as possible. One of the things you might have to think about in that process is, well, do I even have the equipment to make this particular knife? If you aren't careful, sometimes when you're designing knives, you'll design some feature into them that you think you know how to solve, and then later on you're like, uh-oh, that is really much more of a pain in the neck to make than I thought. Basically every feature that you might want to put into a blade has some kind of implication. And let me give you kind of an interesting example. Let's say it's a neck knife here. If you make a neck knife like this design right here, and I was just fooling around, if you made this design, you didn't have those holes in there, you can't put it in a Kydex sheath. And if you're making a neck knife, you pretty much want a Kydex sheath, because the whole idea is that you hang it blade, tip up, and doing that with a leather holster, sheath or something like that, it's just going to fall out. So neck knives are typically made with Kydex sheaths. So let me see here. Oh yeah, here. Just for those of you who haven't seen my stuff in the past, I do a lot of stuff on a CNC machine, and so there's all this complicated tooling and fixturing that goes into making these knives. And this is for making a sheath, actually for the Luna here. If you don't have something that acts as a detent, you're going to have a real problem keeping your blade inside your Kydex sheath. So there again, it's something you have to think about up front. If you know you're going to make this in a leather pouch sheath, then you don't have to worry about having some kind of little feature that the Kydex will grab onto. But in this case, these blue lines here represent the actual sheath itself. So this little section right here is sort of depressed, and therefore it can catch on this surface right here and retain the knife so that you can hang it upside down, and that'll work. If I had made this design right here and didn't put any holes in it, there'd be nothing to grab onto, and I'd have to go back and redesign the knife later. So again, sort of thing that you want to think about up front. The more knives that you make and the more complex the tools that you use to make them, the more that you have to think about all this stuff up front. So in this particular case, this shows you a fixture that I use on my CNC machine to do various operations of this knife. So here I drill holes. Here I basically cut the outline of this thing, mill the outline, and then here there's some added features on the other side, and there's some little these are all little milled and drilled holes that create a sort of stone textured type surface here. It looks kind of cool, but it also gives some grip on the knife. So that all gets done up on the top here, and then over here I do the bevels themselves. So every little aspect of this has to be thought out. All of this stuff has to be designed into the knife. So all of this kind of circles back to what you need in order to design that basic knife. So this is the I guess you would say the bones of the knife here. But that's not what I'm actually going to make. I'm going to actually make this thing here. And then I'm going to grind these pieces off later on. And so I have to know where I'm going here, but then I have to design these intermediate stages. Now, if you're not doing work on CNC, obviously this doesn't apply to you. That's not really my point. My point is just that every time you design a knife, you got to think your way through how you're going to make it. And a lot of times, obviously, you've already made X number of knives in a certain way, and so maybe you're just going to make that same old, you're going to use that same old approach. You're going to take a piece of bar stock, you're going to drill a couple holes on the drill press, you're going to go over to the belt grinder and you're going to grind the profile, and then you're going to, you understand what I'm saying. There's a kind of stock way of doing it. But it doesn't always work like that. Every time you come up with a new design, something that's bigger, smaller, these things come into play. And so it's not unusual that you design a knife, you make it's something that you're planning on making 10 copies of, or 1,000 copies, whatever it might be that fits your little model knife making. And you realize on knife one, oh, that design has some features that are going to just eat me alive when I'm making it. So then you got to go back and sort of go back to this drawing board stage and start thinking your way point by point through the whole design. Okay, now we're back here. I'm going to have to take off more here. I'm going to have to do something here. Today, I'll show you how to make this knife. There's a story behind it. So here's the story. Last week, I went out to Pop's Knife Supply. So let's take somebody like my buddy Joey up at Pop's Knife Supply. He's also a knife maker, and his approach, which I showed on one of my videos maybe about 3-4 months ago, he's got a sort of shrink-wrapped manufacturing approach, which involves making an outline, and then he can hang that outline up on the wall. He can take it off. He lays it out on the stock, then he grinds the profile, and then he grinds the bevel, and he makes the handle. He's got an approach. That approach might work perfectly for a certain sort of set of knives, but if he went out and he decided, oh, you know what, I want to make an art knife, or I want to make, something that's got a real crazy handle, or, whatever it might be, a D-guard Bowie or something like that, something that's sort of outside the zone that he normally goes to, it creates a whole bunch of things that he's got to think about that don't fit his standard model. So every time you design a new blade, you have to kind of work your way through all these problems. And I'm just mentioning a few of them, but things that you might want to think about are heat treating. Do you have the gear to heat treat a particular type of steel that you're planning on using? How many grinding operations are involved? I'll tell you one thing that can be a pretty big pain in the neck. Anytime you have interior curves, like bird's beak type handle or whatever, you're going to have to, I'm not saying you have to, but it's much easier to do if you have a small wheel attachment on your grinder that'll grind these two interior curves. So when you do that, that means that you got to switch over to another attachment. If you're making one of these, big deal. So it's just, you're out there on Saturday afternoon working on it. It's not a problem. But if you're going to make 10 of them, you're going to have to think about, well, am I going to do all 10 of them in sequence, or am I going to swap that attachment in and out and in and out and in and out every single time I do one? These kind of decisions don't seem like a big deal, but if you make 10 of them, if you're trying to, make 10 chef's knives for your buddies at Christmas, all of a sudden, all that swapping out of belts and attachments starts to add up. So it's worth thinking about that when you're designing the knife. Finally, when when it comes to actually physically making the thing, there are a lot of little manufacturing tools that you can use: pallets, jigs, fixtures, drill guides, guard fixtures, filing jigs. Just there are endless numbers of things that will help you to make a knife better and more repeatably. Some of these are just things you can buy off the shelf. You can go to Pops and just buy a particular, grinding jig or something like that. But there are a lot of other ones that you have to tailor specifically to a particular knife. And so, that's just the kind of thing you got to think your way through when you're deciding, oh, yeah, I want to make X number of these. Is it worth making? Is it worth spending all this time? And again, this is CNC specific, but there are perfectly valid reasons for making fixtures to put on your manual mill or your drill press or whatever. But fixtures take an enormous amount of time to make, and so you always have to be thinking your way through in the design phase. Is a fixture going to help me out here? And if it is, how many of these am I going to make? Is it worth the effort of making that fixture? So last point that I'd make here is that anytime you design a knife, it's an iterative process, meaning that you start with, let's say, this little simple knife, and you do your little features on it and stuff, and so you end up with this, and then that takes you to this, and that takes you to this right here. Well, let's say you get to this point and you realize, oh, the way that I've designed this is it's going to be too hard to make this bevel, using the approach that I typically use. You might need to go all the way back and rethink the point on your knife, or rethink the length of the blade, or just some little feature of the knife may make it really hard to produce, and then another hour of work is required to figure out a solution so that once you get back on here, it's going to work out okay. I guess the main thing that I would counsel is, if you want to make a bunch of a particular design, be prepared to keep dogging that design and trying to come up with ways to make it better, so that knife number 10 not only is easier to make, but is better. And to me, that's a big part of the fun of knife design, is not like, oh, here's me sitting down, drawing a design, now I execute that design and I'm done. Part of the fun of it for me is to say, okay, I got 85% of the way there on this particular design, but, I've hung up on something at this stage. The sheath is not, the detent feature is just not working as well as it might. So let's go back to, this stage and see if, as we're kind of auditioning different approaches to this knife, maybe something else, like that's the purpose of this little feature right here. There's sort of a dimple in this particular design that I came up with that was going to give the Kydex a little bit, oops, where's the Kydex? Over here. That would say it would be right here, and that dimple would give the Kydex a little more something to grab onto. So some people probably don't find it fun to think about, refining designs this way, but it is fun to me, and I find it really rewarding. I think a lot of people fixate on just whether a knife looks cool, and that's great, but the functionality, how it feels in your hand, how it's manufactured, all those kinds of things. Once you sort of stick with a design, a sort of design framework for a while, a lot of times if you'll keep dogging that design and making tiny little incremental changes and going back and trying different approaches to it, you'll find that you'll end up with a knife that just works better than the original conception you have. And that's always my goal, is to just keep dogging it and keep trying to improve things in this little incremental way, and ultimately end up with something that's really cool. And, you know, one of the nice things about that, I mean, it feels good to come up with something that's better than the first thing you came up with. But what I've always found is that every time I work through a design several times and come up with a bunch of improvements to it, then the next time that I design a knife, instead of starting from absolute ground zero, I've got a little data bank in my mind of things that I can do from the beginning to make that design better than the previous knife that I made. And that's always my goal. I just want to keep getting better. And I think most people who have a kind of craftsman type mentality feel that way too. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I've probably bored you witless by now. If you stuck through this far, though, you have probably the same nerdy genes that I do. So congratulations to you for that. So anyway, thanks for watching here. If you're interested in picking up a copy of the Luna here, you can find it at my website, tacticsarmory.com. And the goal really was for it to be functional and affordable and kind of look a little cool. But I should mention, one of my goals with the designs that I'm working on right now is I want to be able to have kind of, and I'm maybe getting a little off track here, but I want to have my designs so that if I come up with a basic design, I could say add holes here and then adding handle scales. So I drill holes and add handle scales, but all of the work that I put into this and maybe this will actually still work on a knife that looks a little different, that maybe appeals to somebody that this particular design wouldn't appeal to. It broadens my market a little bit, and you know, keeps things fresh, and it's something fun and new to do. And again, it helps to think ahead if you're, you know, if that's in the realm of things that would be interesting to you, or that fit your sort of little business model or hobby model or whatever. You know, it's a part of the design philosophy of the knife to make it as flexible a platform for other changes going forward as possible. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I know a lot of you might kind of think, well, I'm staring at a computer screen. That's a lot less interesting than watching Walter jam a big old piece of steel into a bunch of flaming hot oil or whatever. But in reality, this is a big part of how I go about doing my job. You know, every knife maker is different. I just had a good friend who makes knives out here, and I was showing him my new CNC machine, and he was like, this thing scares the shit out of me. I guarantee you, he's never designed a blade on a computer, probably never will. So each to his own, right? You know, and obviously when I'm doing this stuff, I don't come within a mile of a computer. So it just goes to show you there's no right way to be a knife maker, just your way. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and keep on making those knives. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.